on how COVID-19 and the new trade agreement is impacting border crossing between Canada and the United States. This is a joint offering from Niagara University of Canada, which is based in Vaughan, and the Niagara University College of Business Administration, where I work in Lewiston, New York. My name is Jack Ampuja, and I've been with Niagara University approximately 20 years. I serve as Executive Director of the Center for Supply Chain Excellence, and I'll be the host and moderator this afternoon. A couple of comments, observations before we start. Number one, this event is being recorded so that we can use it in the classroom and in other situations at the university. Number two, if you're on the line as a participant, please mute your microphones during the panel discussion so that we don't get any background noise. There is the opportunity for you to put questions into the chat box on the screen. If you'd like to pose a question, put it up there, and if we can work them into the program, I will do so. So thank you all for participating today. And now on to the program. We're extremely pleased to have this very veteran group of business executives. I know these gentlemen and I know their schedules. Extremely pleased to be able to pin them down for this presentation. And I'll give each of them a quick introduction, and then when they get around to answering the first question, I'd like them all to expand a little bit more on exactly what they do with their businesses. Our first panelist is Robert Armstrong. Bob is founder and owner of Armstrong Trade and Logistics Advisory Services based in Lindsay, Ontario. I will tell you that Bob is, he wouldn't tell you this himself, but Bob is one of the most well-known, visible supply chain people in Canada. I can't think of a Canadian supply chain event that I've gone to in the last 10 years, whether it's Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, where I haven't bumped into Bob. He's everywhere. Our second panelist today is Michael Carroll. Mike is a co-founder and leads Canusa Logistics, which is a Canadian customs broker based in Fort Erie. And Mike is somebody that I work with on a fairly regular basis. We're just contacting him today about some trucking into Canada. Our third panelist is Wendell Erb. Wendell is Chief Executive Officer of the Erb Group of Companies, family company that's involved in all manner of logistics, based in New Hamburg, Ontario, just outside of Waterloo. I will tell you, although I haven't checked in the last few months, I do believe that Erb Trucking, part of the Erb Group, handles more refrigerated freight between Canada and the United States than any other trucking company. And our fourth panelist is a long-term friend and connection of mine, Pat Whalen. Pat is the recently appointed CEO of the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance, and he is also the Executive Director of the Niagara Global Tourism Institute based in Niagara Falls. So gentlemen, welcome, and let's get on with the show. First thing I'd like each of you to address in turn is how do you think that COVID-19 has impacted businesses, be it your own business if you're running an operation directly like Wendell, or if you're supporting other companies the way that Michael Carroll does. So Bob, why don't you kick us off, tell us a little bit about Armstrong Trade and Logistics, and then give us your perspective on COVID-19.
Okay, thank you, Jack, and good afternoon, everyone. My business is really deals in the global supply chain. So my clients are most of my clients are Canadian, although I have some U.S. clients and some foreign clients. So I try to help them buy and sell their goods anywhere in the world. And the biggest role I play is getting them there and helping them with supply chain issues. My business is a little quiet these days, like everybody else in Ontario. I thought I'd give you two perspectives. One, I happen to be president of my local chamber of commerce and also my golf course. Both which have different impacts of COVID. And in my golf course, for example, manufacturing, as all of you are probably aware, really slowed down in March, April, May. And we've been waiting 3 months to get golf carts new golf carts to come from Colorado, and they're finally coming now. It should be here this week. But factories were shut, and this has had an impact. What you really see is our consumers. They can't travel now, the families, they can't go out of the country anymore, so they're taking their vacation dollars, that they would have spent, and they're buying things like motorhomes, boats, swimming pools for their backyards, and new air conditioning units. You couldn't get in June and early July, you couldn't get an air conditioner. If your air conditioner went, you couldn't even buy a new one. The factories were that far behind. And so that's had a big impact. And of course, our local businesses, like a lot of other places, they're probably running their income's about 25 to 30% of their normal revenues. So they're really been suffering. And a lot of businesses probably aren't coming back in the retail sector, especially those that have restaurants and things like that. And the biggest problem is now in our chamber, just to give you an example, the restaurants are back and they're allowed to open with limited seating and the patios. Now they can't get workers because here in Canada, of course, the federal government gave what we call a CERB. So workers who lost their jobs during COVID could claim $2,000 a month and be paid by the federal government. So a lot of the lower wage earners are staying home. So they want to get back to work. So that's a challenge for businesses. And even auto shops, for example, that when you couldn't get your car fixed, repaired for a while either. So a lot of things changed, but now they're starting to catch up, and this is going to really impact our supply chain again. It's going to make it a lot more busy. And a lot of things, let's face it, are naturally driven on the supply side. So the big point of discussion is whether is employment going to come back to the pre-pandemic level, even if your revenue does, or is there going to be a lot of labor savings permanently done by companies? And what a lot of manufacturers are doing right now, for example, they're not on full shifts yet. Their office workers are working from their home. So we're seeing a lot of services that are now related to the home. So that means that trucking companies, couriers and the like, and the post offices, they're booming because the people are getting more deliveries to their house because they may be working from home. And that's also spurred the manufacturing of home-related office equipment. But the supply chain itself is undergoing a significant change.
Thanks very much for that detailed answer, Bob. Mike Carroll, you're right on the border with Canusa, actively involved with bringing freight into Canada, shipping it out of Canada on behalf of your clients. Tell us your perspective on what COVID-19 is doing. Yep. Mike, you're not coming in here. I can't hear you at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's better.
Am I good?
That's good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon. So I would say, first of all, on our company, so we're a small customs broker based in Fort Erie, Ontario. So our bread and butter core business is customs issues, customs compliance, bringing goods into Canada or shipping back into the United States, the actual clearance of the goods and consultation on compliance issues related to the movement of goods. We also participate in logistics. So we can move containers to and from anywhere in the world. Air freight, we play in that space. We are pretty strong in the e-commerce market, both for customs clearance and for utilizing the different courier options for moving goods throughout North America and again globally. And as we've seen in recent years, e-commerce is really starting to expand. So our first challenge back in March was determining what these new regulations meant to us and whether or not our company was going to be deemed an essential service. And fortunately, it was we were deemed essential service, so we were allowed to remain open. And we had to come up with plans, both working at home options and also how to maintain the office. And fortunately, last year we had just completed a total renovation on our offices. And two of the things that we just happened to do came in handy for COVID. One was that we brought in workstations with barriers between the workstations so we could maintain social distancing. And the other thing was that we had to move our entire operation out of this facility for a period of time. And so we had already had a good working from home option available to us. So as a team, we looked at the risks. We consulted with with the local authorities and what we could and couldn't do. And we implemented a plan to remain in the office, remain open. Probably our biggest challenge was as the plants closed and we started to see those volumes disappear almost overnight. We really had to project for the future without knowing a lot about what our customers were going to do. And of course, they didn't know what they were going to do because they didn't have any more information in a lot of cases than we did. And we had a lot of uncertainty in the early days as to what could and couldn't cross the border. As it turns out, trade has largely remained, as far as the flow of goods across the borders, would largely remain unaffected under COVID, and things have for the most part remained steady. The big changes though is that the government people that we're working with on a regular basis, they're for the most part are working from home, so it's taking longer to get answers and on issues. A lot of our clients are working from home, so we've seen clients with absolute shutdown. We've seen clients that are working from home, greater inefficiencies. In the early days, we saw we had to deal with the challenge of having to remain open, having to maintain services for our customers at the standards to which they were accustomed without knowing what the future volumes were going to be. Fortunately, here in Canada, and I know in the United States, they've had some similar programs that there have been some wage subsidies that have allowed us to weather the storm and to maintain staff and maintain standards with the assistance of the government. And that's been very, very easily accessed. It's helped both our company and it's helped many of our clients just to weather this storm. And even though none of us really know when it's going to end or how it's going to end, we seem to be on a brighter path. We saw the way that volumes went for our business immediately was we saw a spike, and then all of a sudden we saw a drop off, and we were down about 70% from last year, and we've slowly seen those volumes start to increase. More activity at the border. We've signed a lot of clients, especially in the e-commerce space. And so there's a lot of activity going on right now. I wouldn't say the numbers have returned to where they were pre-COVID, but I certainly feel like we're on the right track. We haven't had to lay anyone off, thanks to the support of the government and our clients. And we've also, in the last 30 days, we've actually hired an additional staff member. So we're anticipating growth. We're hoping for the best, like everyone else is, and we're just taking it one day at a time.
Thank you, Michael. Wendell, tell us a little bit about the Herb Group and how COVID-19 is playing out in your company.
Yeah, I'm Wendell Herb Transport. We're a refrigerated transportation distribution company. We're based in New Hamburg, Ontario. That's head office. We have terminals in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. We have about 800 power units and 1,200 trailers. And when COVID first came around, we had the same experience that in March, we had our best March that we'd seen in a long time. It was a real spike. Everybody was buying groceries, and now from our customer standpoint, we're a service provider. So our food service dropped off dramatically. I'm going to say 90%. We had customers that we would deliver, 2 or 3 loads a day into them, and that dropped down to 1 pallet going in. On the flip side, the grocery customers we have, which is larger than food service, their volumes didn't go up 90%, but they probably went up 50-60%. And then the challenge we run into is their supply chain couldn't handle it. So we had delays. We had customers who couldn't get the product through their distribution centers out to their stores. So we come up with alternative programs where we deliver directly to the stores. So that was kind of how March went on, and then it just fell off a cliff. So everything that we delivered extra in in March and early April. Everybody had their toilet paper and bacon, and April was probably the worst April we've ever experienced. And also to the point where all the programs to support business, etc., we always fell just underneath where the threshold of getting help on any of these programs. So it's been a slow climb back. I would say in late July and into August here, we're kind of back at our pre-COVID numbers in terms of revenue, volume, shipments, and so on. We have spent, at last count, it was about $115,000 on just COVID-related, whether it's sanitizing, protective equipment, masks, that type of thing. We still have a good percentage of our back office people that can work from home are still working from home, and it's been surprisingly effective and efficient. But then we have a lot of other employees where you have to be on site, where our dock workers, our routers, our drivers, obviously. Our dispatchers, we did something unique there. We split our fear was that we are the definition of an essential service in the food side of things, and we were afraid that we just can't have this come through a terminal, and so we split up our dispatchers, and we sent we'd have half of them at home for 2 weeks, and then they would come back and work in the office for 2 weeks, and the people would rotate back and forth on that, and the dispatchers that were home or in customer service people, that type of thing, couldn't wait to get back to work and work in the office again. But at the same time, we were actually undergoing office renovations at our main dispatch terminal. So we had people spread out throughout the whole building, so that the whole COVID actually kind of worked out. The timing of it worked out good, other than our construction crew took about a 3-week hiatus in it, and we said, hey, you may as well come to work, there's nobody here. Threw it out. So, but all in all, it's like I said, we're back to normal at this point. But for our customers, some of the people that were heavy in food service, I don't see some of the restaurants coming back. I don't see some of the volume coming back. They're really, I can't say this has been a positive experience for any of our customers.
Interesting detail, Wendell. Thank you. Pat Whalen, tell us a little bit about the CanMBTA or the Tourism Institute or whichever, and how you see COVID-19.
Well, I'll talk about the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance first. That was formed 28 years ago when the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was being implemented. It was started by a guy named Jim Phillips, and unfortunately, I'm taking his place because he passed away about 3 weeks ago. And so he's been it. And that business has 3 forms of revenue. One of them is dues paying members. Most companies that do business on both sides of the border pay dues to the CanMBTA. And a lot of governments do as well, or government agencies, provincial or state governments who are federal agencies. And then there's 2 conferences, one in Ottawa in the spring and one in Washington, D.C. in the fall. And we didn't have the Ottawa conference in the spring, and we're not having the D.C. conference in the fall. So there's a direct hit to the top line for the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance. The dues have been holding up pretty well. Most people are paying the dues, although not everyone is. And it seems to me that businesses that are impacted by COVID are either booming or bust. There doesn't seem to be a lot in the middle. So our members who are not doing well, they're not paying the dues. And the ones that are doing well, they are paying the dues. So that's the way that business is impacted. I'm sitting in an incubator in Niagara Falls, New York, and we have a relationship with an incubator in Niagara Falls, Canada called Spark. This incubator I'm in is called Trek. And obviously, we can't do much together anymore because we can't cross the border, even though we can almost see each other. That's been pretty frustrating. The companies in Niagara Falls incubator, Niagara Falls Canada incubator, that are scaling, and they're mostly education tech companies, and they need to scale in the United States, and that's becoming difficult for them to do because they're in Niagara Falls, Canada, can't come to the United States. We have tourism technology companies that are scaling here, and the natural place for them to scale is in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Obviously, we can't do that. So that's impacting the incubation business. The tourism business in general, I think everybody understands, is been decimated. I mean, I don't really even, it's too early to tell who will come back and who won't. Certainly the restaurant business is severely impacted. The hotels in Niagara Falls, New York, operated at about 24% occupancy in June. Niagara Falls, Canada, they're 9% occupancy in June. And you really need to run hotels at about 61% occupancy for the year to make money. And obviously, in a seasonal place like Niagara Falls, we don't operate at 61% in the winter. We operate much lower than that. In the summer, we're booming, close to 100% occupancy. So right now we're way below that. So it's going to be difficult for hotels to hang on. Not as bad as it is for restaurants, I don't think, but certainly it's going to be a tough road for the hospitality sector. Both Niagara Falls, New York, and Niagara Falls, Canada depend greatly on non-North American tourists. China in Niagara Falls, Canada, and India and China in Niagara Falls, New York, and both of those markets are gone. The bus business is gone. I just went to by the casino here in Niagara Falls, New York, and noticed the bus parking area is completely empty. Not a single bus there. At this time of year, it would be full. I did just walk through the state park in the Niagara Falls, New York side, and was pleasantly surprised to see how many people there. It was quite crowded. But that's not surprising. Certainly not anywhere near what it normally is, but it's not surprising to see that we have a lot of people here in July and August, because those 2 months are when Americans come to Niagara Falls, New York, and obviously a lot of them are here. There are a lot of states, 33, I think, states right now, that if you come from those states to New York State, you have to quarantine for 14 days. Obviously, people who are going to go on vacation don't have an extra 14 days to quarantine. So if they're on that list, they're not coming to Niagara Falls, New York. They can't go to Niagara Falls, Canada, because they can't cross the border. So most of the people that I saw today in Niagara Falls, New York, were from states that are not on the list. Ohio, luckily, just went off the list. That's a big market for us in states, Pennsylvania. But we're really severely limited as to where we can draw tourists from to Niagara Falls. I'll leave it there because I have two hats to wear.
Okay, thanks, guys. Strange times indeed for all of us. So we're going to shift gears and move on to the free trade agreement. And let me just provide a little background perspective on this so that everybody's on the same page. Many people have either forgotten or never knew that there was actually a free trade agreement between Canada and the United States that went into effect in January of 1988. That was shortly before I moved here to Western New York. And it was just the two countries, Canada, USA, and that worked out to the benefit of both countries, to the point that Mexico then said they'd like to be part of the free trade agreement. So in January of '94, 6 years later, North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that President Trump has termed the worst trade agreement in the history of the world. I beg to differ, but anyway, that's one opinion. That went into effect, and terrific numbers between the three countries. But very recently, since the election of Donald Trump as president, the agreement was renegotiated and updated. And one of the intriguing things about it is that each of the three countries has a different nomenclature for this free trade agreement. Here in the United States, we call it the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In Canada, it's the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. In Mexico, it's known as TMEC. the agreement between Mexico, United States, and Canada. So we don't even have the same name for this agreement, which to me sounds very strange, but that's reality. So I'm going to ask Bob Armstrong to lead off with his observation on CUSMA, as it's known in Canada. Do you see CUSMA as good or bad or somewhere in the middle, Bob?
Well, my view is it's much better than the worst case scenarios. So that's good. For some industries, like the auto parts industry, it could be an improvement over NAFTA for Canadian auto parts producers, manufacturers. And that's because there's limits on how much can come from low wage facilities in Mexico. So also the regional content rules, it's higher, not just in the headline numbers, but also in the way things are counted in the rules of origin. All of this is going to make, could make costs higher. That's one of my fears. And that could be bad for North American competitiveness globally. So that's a fear. And my view is that the Trump administration thinks the US market is the only thing that matters on the demand side. So it's a challenge for us in Canada.
Excellent, Bob. And Mike Carroll, you're in the middle of this thing. The USMCA or CUSMA on your side went into effect a few weeks ago, July 1st. What is your impression of the trade agreement? Good or bad? Mike, your volume, turn your volume back up. You're muted again. Okay, there you go.
I tend to agree with Bob. First of all, it's a lot better than what it could have been, because this whole renegotiation of this agreement was done at the request or insistence of President Trump. And so just a couple of observations. First of all, the Canadian and US economy especially is so highly integrated that 38 US states call Canada their largest single trading partner. And there's a lot of unique things about our trade with the United States. We're somewhere around just under $1 trillion a year in trade and goods, but it's pretty close to a 50-50 trade. 50-50. We might have a small trade surplus with the United States, or that might change from time to time where they have a small trade surplus with us. But it's very well balanced trade, very highly integrated. I think you've heard the stories where automotive cars will sometimes, components will cross the border several times before the final product is finished. We send energy to the United States. We buy energy from the United States. And you go down the line, pharmaceuticals, food, every industry is so highly integrated that it's hard to imagine tearing up NAFTA entirely and seeing what is left. So in that respect, it's a good agreement. It's a good agreement for Canada in that that we owe so much of our economy and our growth to our relationship with the United States. To have an economy of that size that we can participate in equally and be a major part of. That's a bonus for Canada, and we offer a lot of benefits to the United States as far as their goods coming northbound. So all in all, NAFTA was a great agreement. This continued much of what was good in NAFTA has been continued. Except I agree with Bob too, that the jury, I think, is going to be out on the automotive, because the automotive is the one part of the agreement where it seems like the government is taking a little more of a heavy hand. They're trying to move more steel production into North America. They're trying to move more production out of low-cost Mexico back into the United States, putting quotas on cars and forcing additional burdens on the manufacturers and their suppliers for reporting and compliance, and the penalties. The penalties for non-compliance are heavy, so it's going to drive up costs inevitably, but it's also going to drive up wages for it'll probably have the effect of benefiting our automotive manufacturers. We just need to make sure that the automotive industry remains strong and that cars continue to sell, and as long as that happens, the jury's still out. Everywhere else in the agreement, though, I would say that it's benefited the North American manufacturers, especially the Canadian and U.S. manufacturers. For instance, in the rules of origin for manufactured goods are based on the harmonized classification system and the value or the value added in North America. So it allows for foreign components of foreign inputs to be used in the manufacturing process. And under NAFTA, the Annex 401 covered that what those rules changes needed to be based on a specific commodity. So those rules were largely kept intact or they were relaxed. So in a number of areas, in chemicals, actually right across the board, the rules are either the same or they're easier. So that's going to be a benefit for North American manufacturers. And the other thing that they raised in the agreement that I think was very positive was it was possible to manufacture a good in North America and not have it qualify for NAFTA because of a tariff classification of one of the inputs that you might import from a third country. Well, so now what's happened is they've raised the de minimis level from 7 to 10%, which means if you have an input that's under the wrong classification number that prevents you from claiming preferential treatment, the value, as long as that value now is under 10%, you can treat it as though it's North American. So there's, all in all, for the average person, not a lot of big change, although I will, if we're going to come back to this a little later, I'd like to talk about certification, because to me, that's the major change for most Canadian and American companies, other than the fact that automotive is what it is. The rest of the agreement seems to be moving in the right direction. And then things that are concerned with government, labor standards in Mexico, and or rights to organize, and all of those things that don't really affect us on a day-to-day basis are all written into that agreement too. So there's a lot of positives, few question marks, but just thank God there's an agreement in place that, for all intents and purposes, maintains NAFTA.
Thanks, Mike. And certainly the automotive industry is a big cog in the economy here in Western New York and in Southern Ontario. And while I don't track the automotive industry in great detail, my understanding is that the comment from that side of the business sector would be similar to what you heard from Wendell Erb earlier, that big drop off, coming back pretty strongly, but until unemployment gets back down to normal levels, if people aren't working, I would think that they're going to have difficulty justifying a new car. But right now, I think the business is surprisingly strong. And Wendell, coming back to you, you run a great big trucking fleet for the Erb family, and you're very active with the Canadian trucking industry. How do you see that CUSMA is going to be impacting the trucking industry as a whole, plus or minus?
We view the agreement very positively in the trucking industry. I agree with Mike that the trade is balanced. Virtually every one of our trucks that goes into the U.S. with a low
That's
return.
the one coming up in that's the November one.
So we have each around the country, right?
70% of the exports of Canada go to the U.S. 40% of our GDP is with the U.S. And what's particularly positive about having the agreement is while the negotiations were going on, there was a lot of uncertainty for our shippers. Shippers are making plans about where my distribution center is going to be, what side of the border do I want to be on. Having the agreement in place is when our shippers have certainty and know what the rules are and know what the classifications, everything are, they can make plans and move forward. When there's uncertainty, things kind of grind to a halt. So in general, we're thrilled that there's an agreement there in place, and I can see continued growth. I look back to 1994 or the early 90s, and we had a plant here in Canada that it would produce every product that was sold in Canada at that plant in small quantities. Well, as we watched the evolution of free trade, that plant in Canada was reduced to making only 1 or 2 products, but they shipped them across North America. And they did the same in the US, where, you know, plants in Michigan would produce products that would, 1 or 2 products, and that would be shipped across Canada also. And we're the beneficiary of that as truckers, where we went from a small regional distribution to servicing these plants that were going across Canada. So we're, you know, completely in favor of this in the trucking industry, and thrilled that it's we have an agreement.
Thanks, Wendell. Let me piggyback onto Wendell's comments there that although I work for Niagara University in the United States, I grew up in the city of Winnipeg in central Canada, did all of my public school education there, and started work in the real world with a small consulting firm in New York City. The first place they sent me to was Toronto. So I grew up in Canada, started my business career there. And once upon a time when I worked for Rich Products, I was a customer of Wendell's, and what Wendell described was an exact replica of what happened at Rich Products. A factory in Fort Erie, Ontario, making a whole bunch of little products, now making very long runs of products that go all over North America. And that kind of change happened throughout the food industry. Virtually every big company has made those kinds of moves, and Wendell's comments are right on target for how things changed and how it was beneficial to local factories and so on, that the business didn't go away, it just became more focused and much more efficient. Pat, let's come back to you, that your focus with the Tourism Institute is to build tourism for Niagara Falls, New York. How is USMCA going to impact your institute and its objectives?
Well, I'll start by saying there's another organization here that's responsible for attraction. We're more on the infrastructure side. And one part of that infrastructure side is entrepreneurship. So I'm sitting in the technology incubator where we help companies develop, or entrepreneurs develop their ideas into companies. And one of the things we're disappointed, but beyond the USMCA or CUSMA, depending on which side of the board you're on, I don't think there's much in it that affects tourism. But on the entrepreneurship side, it seems to me that when the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was passed and then expanded to NAFTA, economic development was about talent going to where the infrastructure was. And today, the infrastructure follows talent. And one of the things we're really disappointed in the trade agreement, the new trade agreement, is there's not much change on mobility of people. So to give you an example, Microsoft has extensive operations in Vancouver because they can't get people into the United States, but they can get them into Canada. And there's many examples of this on the technology side, and really higher skilled jobs, technology, medical technology, things like that. There's no change. And when I was in Washington, when the agreement was passed at the Can-Am BTA conference, and 2 days before the conference, everybody said, oh, there's not going to be an agreement. And that would probably have been the worst case scenario, as everybody has, I think, indicated. Then when it passed, while we were in Washington, everybody said, whoa, glad that got passed. But then as we looked at it, we said, geez, there's nothing in here that promotes the mobility of talent between the two countries. And that's a disappointment, especially on the technology side of what we do here. And I know the same applies to Spark in Niagara Falls, Canada. The ability to move people across the border, people to work on the other side of the border in high-skilled jobs, is really not addressed in any different way than it was under NAFTA, which frankly was negotiated in a different time. It needs to change because we need to move people around, and that's a disappointment.
Thank you, Pat. And I would echo your comments 100%. As a small consultant, I've run into the same thing, trying to get justification to have people from Canada work in the US or US to work in Canada. And it seems to me that that there is a tremendous amount of detail that could be worked through that neither country should lose. It would be just like the freight, as Wendell and Mike have said, freight is almost even, Stephen. I think if they cleared up that professional opportunity for people who are well-trained and educated, I don't think you're going to see much job loss on either side. I think it'll end up being very even, Stephen, but that does need to change. It's a big hole in the relationship right now, unfortunately. And Bob, let me come back to you, that your consulting practice specializes in international trade. That's the name of your company, Trade and Logistics Advisory Service. What are you advising your clients about dealing with CUSMA?
Well, first off, I try to help companies keep it simple. And I was recently at a seminar in Detroit that Dickinson Wright Law Firm were putting on. And there would have been a lot of Canadian companies there and from Ontario. They would have decided to get out of exporting, and that's not what we should be doing here. The reality is there are some challenges, and you can't assume, for example, that your old certificate of origins are still good, because CUSMA has a lot of what I call subtle changes in the way things are calculated in the rules of origin. Also, the indication that CUSMA is more of a living document. People have to expect that there's going to be changes happening more frequently than they did under NAFTA. And I think that you're going to see more manufacturing come home. And especially manufacturing, I'm going to use auto parts again because that's always a big one, but we import, believe it or not, a lot of aftermarket auto parts from China. I think there's some great opportunities now in the CUSMA that Canadian companies can get more involved to manufacture at home here in Ontario. I think we're going to see more manufacturing at home, which is going to then they're going to have to look for where, you know, a bigger market can't be just the Ontario market. So they've got to look to the United States and Mexico even. So we always have to look at where are the opportunities. And that's what I always try to do in my business. The other part I do is I talk to my clients about, you know, being very close to their carrier, like Wendell's company. You know, Wendell, I know you're very proud of your company, and you should be, because you have a first-class reputation in the refrigerated business. And I tell my clients that you need to be closer to them than you do to me. Secondly, I think custom brokers. I think Mike, when you were talking earlier, I think your business is going to be even more profound. And I tell people that, look, and I'm nothing against lawyers, so please don't take me wrong, but when the guy's charging $500 an hour, I tell somebody, why don't you first go to your custom broker, kind of see what they charge you to relook at your certificates of origin. You might find instead of spending $5,000 or $10,000, it might only be a few hundred. And so that's how I try to do things. I know it probably sounds bad for the lawyers, especially the ones that hosted me that I was speaking at their law firm, but we have to take the mystery out of things. That's really what we all should be doing. And I know, Jack, you did it in your practice, like, because you and I have worked together. You got to take the mystery out and show people the opportunity. And people just need to understand, it's like everything else. You wouldn't be a good golfer if you didn't prepare. So you have to prepare. And then to prepare, part of your preparations have to be regular meetings with your carriers, with your custom broker, maybe, and your lawyer and your accountant. But I think you should always look at free trade agreements, so like CUSMA, like we did NAFTA in the previous Canada-US free trade agreement. Look where the opportunities are and exploit them by going to the best people you can to help you.
Excellent advice, Bob. Thank you. Michael Carroll, how is USMCA or CUSMA, depending on which side of the border, how is the trade agreement going to impact your customers? Oh, turn your volume up again, Mike. I know what's happening. You're turning the volume down so you don't have any background noise.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
Alrighty. So I think what Bob alluded to is when he talks about the certificate of origin, one of the and subtle changes in the agreement, and this is probably one of the most important changes. To give you an example, under NAFTA, they had to form the exporter certificate of origin, so that in order to claim the preferential treatment, your exporter would supply you with a certificate of origin showing that they had reviewed the specific rules to that commodity and that the goods do qualify. So now what they've done is Customs is asking for data points to be submitted in any way, in a number of ways. It could be very casually declared on the customs invoice, and the responsibility now falls to the importer. How the importer holds others accountable for the information that they must provide, so that the importer can make the determination whether or not they can claim the preferred tariff. That's really up to the importer, and our industry seems to have come up. I know our company has. We've come up with a form that looks very similar to the NAFTA certificate of origin, called the CUSMA or USMCA certificate of origin, and it's a form that the importer can give to their suppliers, so that they have some assurance that certain information that's beyond their control is conveyed to them, so that they can make a proper declaration on the customs entry. And I mentioned earlier the rules, Annex 401, which was under NAFTA, replaced by Chapter 4 of the current agreement, and those rules are very similar. And so there's really two areas in those rules. They talk about a tariff shift of inputs. So in other words, if you're bringing in materials from outside of North America into the manufacturing process, they want you to look at the tariff classification of those inputs, and then the rule will say if these inputs are classified under these classification numbers, the goods don't qualify. But if they're outside of these classification of numbers, then the goods do qualify. So the tariff harmonized classification now becomes very important. You talk about sitting down with your customs broker. Most companies don't even know how the harmonized classification that's being used on their imports across the border was ever determined. It could have been just a customs clerk asking a few questions over the phone and finding something that's relatively reasonable, but no further research beyond that went into it. And if the goods were duty-free, or if whatever the duty rate was acceptable to the importer and never questioned, then these things are never questioned. So now you've got rules that the enforcement on this is going to be, this is the way it's going to look. An importer is going to decide whether he wants to claim the preferred treatment. You buy something from a company in the United States that manufactured it, you might assume, okay, those goods qualify. Well, there are a lot of scenarios where they won't qualify. So now you need to be able to track that back. What was the harmonized classification that they brought their inputs under? How is that classification determined, so that you can make the proper determination on the rules? This whole thing can get fairly complicated, and Canada has allowed, so if you choose not to claim NAFTA privileges, so you pay duty on whatever the prescribed rate of duty is, and then you say, we're going to revisit this, and once we have a definitive answer, we're going to go back and file refund claims. Well, Canada will allow you 4 years to do that under this, whereas the United States will only allow you 1. Likewise, if Canada finds, if 3 years from now they want to audit your entries, and they want to determine whether or not the goods that you've been importing and claiming those benefits under, whether or not they are indeed eligible, then you need to know that the harmonized classification. You need to know how that declaration was arrived at. That's a really heavy burden, and that's a far different burden than asking your supplier to supply you with a NAFTA certificate. And as long as you have it in hand, even if your privileges were revoked under NAFTA, Customs would go easy on you. They would know that they would be threatening your business if they hit you with 3 years of back duties. Under this scenario, there's no one to look at but yourself. You can't look at your customs broker. You can't look at your supplier, even though you're relying on both parties to provide you with very accurate information. Your customs broker to provide you with the proper harmonized classification that can withstand an audit, and your supplier to properly declare all the inputs that go into the manufacturing process. And when you multiply that, what most Canadian companies, when they ship to the United States, they act as the importer. They hire the U.S. broker, and so they can easily certify their southbound shipments. But coming northbound, in most cases, they also act as the importer, which means they might have dozens of different American suppliers that are shipping goods to them, and each supplier might pose a different challenge. And so, to me, that is the number one thing to be on the lookout for. That is the number one warning that I would say under this new agreement. Beware of that, because that's the thing that can really come back and bite you. On the good side, on the positive side, the huge difference, and the timing couldn't be better, is in the e-commerce space. So the U.S. Allows shipments valued at $800 or less, individual shipments, B2C, kind of e-commerce type shipments crossing without any sort of brokerage formality, any customs formality from Canada, regardless of the country of origin. You can bring products in from China, store them here in Canada to fill into the United States. If you ship them direct to the United States in a container, you'd pay the most favored nation tariff plus a 25% surcharge under the tariffs. But if you brought those into Canada and you were going southbound individual orders, they'd sail through duty free. Great opportunity there. Canada raised their thresholds coming northbound. We did it $40 Canadian, US is 800, we're 40 Canadian, duty and tax free, and then up to $150 duty free but not tax free. And that's because we're a completely different economy than the United States, and we have to we just have to support our retail outlet. We can't undermine our own domestic system. So, and we have a national sales tax, GST. So those are the two issues. On the pro side, e-commerce revolutionized, easy for Canadian companies to access the U.S. market in e-commerce, easier for U.S. companies to come northbound into Canada and expand up here, and of course certification number one on my list, and that, so talking to a customs broker, talking to people and making sure. So if you're heading up a company, you probably the topic of harmonized classification you've probably never even heard it or concerned yourself with that topic before. Now it's something that you need to be aware of, because that to me is a major change. And this whole process is the way trade agreements of the future are going. With our CETA agreement with Europe and our CPTPP agreement with the Asia Pacific Rim, we're doing the exact same thing. That's the way certification is being done, and we're moving away from these exporter certificates of origin.
Thanks for that nice detail, Mike. What I'm hearing is that the complexity with the trade agreement is nothing but good news for someone like you, Mike, or for Bob Armstrong. Someone right in the middle of this fray is going to benefit because of the problems. So we've got just about 5 minutes to go, time for a couple of more questions. And let me come back to you, Wendell. Your trucking fleet moves all kinds of refrigerated loads back and forth between the two countries every single day. How is that trade agreement going to affect your trucking operation and your customers?
Well, personally, in our trucking operation, we have really seen no change in what we do. But I need to, preface that we're a service provider. The shipments get tendered to us. We pick up the shipments. We forward the paper to the custom brokers like Mike as required. We get our releases and we do our job. So for our customers, they've probably had a bunch of changes such as what Mike has discussed. We don't see that as a carrier. We are aware of all the different agencies we have to see, depending on which direction we're crossing the border. Whether it's USDA or FDA, Fish and Wildlife, APHIS, you name it. And that's one of the things we pride ourselves in is we know when we're hauling certain commodities, these are the things we have to do over and above the normal transaction. And excuse me. So, and there's many a time we're told at the primary inspection that okay, you're cleared and away we go. Well, our drivers know that no, I have to go over here for a USDA inspection and to continue that. But that's been the same before and the same after. So in general, there has really been a big change for us as truckers.
Very good. Thank you, Wendell. And then Pat Whalen, last question of the day. you're seeing, all of us are seeing a double barrel hit from COVID-19 and from the new trade agreement. How long do you think it's going to be before we get back to some form of normalcy, and whatever that means, to be back to normal? I don't think anyone knows what that means, but what do you think is going to happen? Pat, put your crystal ball in front of us. And what are you advising businesses that rely on tourism?
Well, wow, that's the million-dollar question I think all of us have, is how long is this going to last? And I don't think anybody has the answer. We're hearing more and more about vaccinations being available, and I think that's probably the key to the tourism industry. I think from the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance perspective, we have our spring conference scheduled in May in Ottawa. And even if the border restrictions are lifted, how many people are going to be willing to travel on an airplane, because they come from all over the United States and Canada, to the conference? How many people are willing to get on an airplane or a train and go to Ottawa? We don't know that. And that's the same thing with tourism and the tourism business. We just don't know. It's the worst part, frankly. I think the worst part about this is we just don't know when things are going to get better. Because I think when there's let's say there is a vaccination, I think we'll get better quickly. But right now it's just inching along. In Niagara Falls, New York, and Niagara Falls, Canada, it's really just right now. I don't think anybody in India is planning on getting on an airplane anytime soon to come to Niagara Falls, New York, and anybody in China is getting on an airplane to come to Niagara Falls, Canada, until they can feel comfortable doing that. Just as I don't think people are going to go to Ottawa for our conference in May. So as far as advice for businesses that rely on tourism, it's actually advice I've given to a lot of different businesses, no matter what industry they're in. And I remember saying it early on, in early days in March, cash is king. You're going to need cash to survive this. And I think that I've been advising businesses of all shapes and sizes and all industries. Hang on to your cash. Somehow, some way, hang on to your cash. You're going to need cash to make it through.
Excellent, Pat. Thank you. So that's the end of the session, right on target. My clock says 4 o'clock exactly. So thank you, gentlemen, for the comments, all of the insights. It's been a blast listening to you. I've learned a lot, like I always do, listening to experts. It's been great being on the program with you. Thank you to all the people who joined us. We will have a recording of this. If you want to do any follow-up, you can contact us through Niagara University, and we can connect you to any one of the panelists. And hopefully we'll connect again with a future session. Thank you, and good luck to everybody.